Okay, hi. Thank you everyone for joining us. I'm Sam. I'm the founder of Eddy Magazine and publisher. Um, I'm really excited to have this panel today. For those of you who don't know, Eddy was founded after the Tamil genocide. For me, it was supposed to be a way of bridging the gap between policy and the intimate spaces of impact. Um, I think over the years, and definitely over the last few years, we've seen that maybe that gap is too wide, between the two, and there's not really going to be a braided essay that reaches from a mass grave to the top floor of the UN. So I think that Eddy now has changed, as every political project does over the years, and I think for me, we've become more sort of accidental cartographers of consciousness. No, it's become a little bit more of a mapping project that kind of measures the distance between limited imaginations and lived experience. And I think there was, for me, this panel in particular, I think every writer should befriend a translator because it's, knowing the people on this panel and Heather in particular and Mina Kandasamy, who have made me look at language completely differently in the meaning of certain words. We recently, Eddy had hosted the very first Olim dialogues at the Kochi Biennale, which was a big deal for us. And I was in conversation with the writer, Anouk Ardpragasam, an Olim Tamil fiction writer, and I wanted to put his work in direct conversation with some of the former fighters on the island. And there was a writing group that had happened through a young woman there, and they shared some of the fighters' writing, and there was a poem, and we translated it quickly before the event because we wanted it to be like, she just wrote this week, we wanted to be in conversation with him. And the lines of the poem that came out in English were, "When our children are asked, 'Who is your mother?' we raise them to be able to prove us. We do not ask for pity, we ask for recognition." And I had sent it to Anouk like 10 minutes before we were going to speak, and Anouk is also a translator. And he said, "This is beautiful, you should read it, but let's make sure the translation is correct." And he changed it to, "And we raise our children so that when they are asked one day, 'Who is your mother?' they will have to attest to us." And it was such a significant small shift that meant everything, and he wanted to be sure that he was in conversation with the intent of the fighter and that the English didn't come in between the Tamil meaning. And so, yeah, this panel, on the politics of translation, something that is very Eddy. A couple of years ago, there was a whole sort of conversation around like, what's the mission and how do we define it? And it was very difficult for me. And I sort of resisted the entire conversation because for me, I think the project is in the pages. If you read the pages of Eddy, it's there. And I think even one of our recent pieces that was quite beautiful on the ethics of ambiguity, I think about ambiguity a lot and its importance. And so I think what we're trying to do is an ambiguity that, resists categorization or siloing as a whole, but really values this, like the thoughtful translation that folks on this panel engage in, which is the insistence on a precision in meaning that begins to kind of trace new fault lines or contours of unexpected terrains of resistance without necessarily falling into blanket titles and labels and categories. And so I'm just so grateful that you all took the time to be a part of this, because each one of you is such a brilliant translator and writer and thinker. And I will hand it over to Chenxin to start this conversation.
Yeah, of course. Um, well, on behalf of all of us on the panel, thank you so much to you and to Adi Magazine for hosting this conversation, both here and now, sort of virtually, and also in the pages of the magazine, as you said, and all of the echoes that these ideas and concepts have throughout the work of all of the folks that you feature. Um, my name is Chenxin. I'm a translator. I am going to okay, and how this is going to go is I'm going to quite briefly introduce everyone who's on the panel. We're going to get a conversation started. What's actually often very fun about these events is that we've had a conversation started already. So we're just excited to invite you into the conversation that's already been going on between the several of us, like by email and online. Um, and then we'll leave about a quarter of an hour at the end for questions. Yeah, with that, I'm going to go right ahead and start by introducing Alaa. Alaa Alqaisi is a Palestinian writer, translator, and researcher from Gaza, also a newly minted PhD candidate at Trinity College Dublin, whose work has appeared in Arab Lit and Arab Lit Quarterly, where she focuses on narratives of resistance and survival. Heather Cleary is a writer and award-winning translator based in Mexico City. Her writing has appeared in Two Lines, Lit Hub, and Poets and Writers, among other places. She wrote a book called The Translator's Visibility, which focuses on narratives of translation in contemporary Latin American fiction, and sort of explores notions of intellectual property and propriety. And she's currently writing a novel about translation and betrayal. And Nedra Rodrigo is an award-winning translator, scholar, and curator of multi-art events. She's the founder of the Tamil Studies Symposium in Toronto, as well as an event series memorably called the Tam Fam Lit Jam. What a great name. Her translations include In the Shadow of the Sword and the Devankatan Quintet, Prison of Dreams, as well as a new translation of Rashmi's Songs in a Time of Confinement, which received the inaugural Penn Translates and Salt Award and will come out with Trace in 2026. Folks on the panel, I guess I should say a couple of things about myself. Here goes. I am a translator working multilingually from Italian, German, and Chinese. I was born in Singapore and grew up in Hong Kong and now live in Denver in the US. I serve on the board of the American Literary Translators Association as its president. Okay, so with all of that said, I think one of the super basics that we could cover off for everyone, which I think I got into a little bit, but not necessarily full on in introductions, is just sort of what languages you translate from and how you came to translation. And I think for these open questions, I'll toss them out there. Whoever feels like it can respond, and then at some point I'll just sort of move us on to the next question.
Yeah, I'll start.
Yeah, go for it.
Hi, I translate mainly between English and Arabic, and I came to translation through professional work across many fields, not through literature actually. And then for years, I was just doing the job as a task, I do in my laptop. But during the war in Gaza, everything had changed. Translation stopped feeling like a task, and now it has to pay something I have to do every day. Because it's the one that of the few tools that I have to do, and I have also to share testimonies with people outside Gaza. So I found myself working on texts that were at the same time witness and art, and I realized I needed to treat them with differently. And also, translation also pushed me into writing, and there is a story behind that. There is an Irish friend called James Heaney who it teaches English in Corlo, and he asked me to translate an Arabic text in Anne Carson book called the Norma, and it was talking about it was quoted a Yemeni engineer who's speaking about the sky that was weaponized. And that day it was raining through the broken roof of the flat I was living that time. So I sent him the translation, and I was like, this is I can't. It's not difficult to understand what he means because the sky above me was really weaponized. And he told me that time, this reflection is part of the story. You must write about that. And that's where I started publishing as a writer too. It was long, sorry.
That's perfect. I love that so often people have a story that journeys from, writing to translation, and you've got a story that goes the other way around.
Okay, I guess I'll go next. I think I started translating when I was a kid by accident, just after the riots of '83, because I lost a lot of my classmates, but we also lost a lot of our teachers. We when we were in school, we were in these small groups where and there were the few Tamil teachers would sort of rotate from one class to another. And so there'd be groups of us sort of sitting around with nothing to do, so we tell each other stories. And so we were all Tamil kids, so all the Tamil kids had seen all the Tamil movies that were, circulating through these like pirated VHS tapes. Don't tell anyone. But I was one of the few people that also watched English movies. So since none of them watched the English movies, I would tell them the English stories in Tamil. So that was, I never realized that that's what I was doing, that I was translating until years later. In Canada, like for a while, I was translating refugee stories. So when people's stories when they were going through refugee hearings. And then later, I had approached, because I was writing an essay on literature and the arts in global Asia. So I had approached a professor at the University of Toronto, and he suggested, well, because I wanted him to translate a couple of poems for me, and he said, "Why don't you do it yourself?" And that sort of suddenly, nobody tells you this, but the moment you start translating in these very urgent spaces, it snowballs. So that's how I got my start.
Amazing, Nedra. Thank you.
And I translate from Spanish into English, and there was really sort of no urgency to the way I got my start. It was more sort of an artistic, intellectual curiosity that drew me to translation, and also a failed senior thesis in college. That one of my professors kind of suggested that I try my hand at translation. And I found just this incredible love for the process of working with language so closely, and kind of the way of fitting the pieces of these puzzles together. So I was just sort of immediately hooked, from, like I said, sort of from an aesthetic and intellectual perspective. And it wasn't until many years later that I sort of began to really see the political dimensions of the work that we do and its potential both inside and outside of literary fields. So that was sort of the journey that I took. It was a little bit in reverse, I suppose.
Really cool too. I mean, I think lots of people come to translation via the sort of nuts and bolts or the like interesting intellectual problems in translation, and then find themselves like inevitably grappling with the political dimension, as you said. Amazing. Okay, cool. Let me think about what a good place to start would be. So maybe one place where we could start is just, around this question of translation choices, and how how they're like sort of inherently political, and how the choices that we make can challenge, the hegemonic narratives at play in all of our respective regions. So I'm wondering if some of you could sort of say something about these choices in your own work.
Yeah, I'll start. Translation is never neutral. And when I say translation choices are political, I mean, the words we choose maybe sometimes is can support power or question it. One level is the basic vocabulary. For example, in the Gaza context, when I choose words like conflict or genocide, do I say people died or people were killed? These are not things that are neutral. They tell the reader if what happened was something abstract or technical or a clear act that done by someone to someone, you know. So that's a level of vocabulary. Another level is how much I make the text comfortable for the international reader or for the English reader. You know, this is called by Venuti as a domestication and foreignization. So when I translate from Gaza, I keep sometimes a word, a rhythm that might feel a little bit strange, and that would make the English reader stop and think about that. That word and that voice comes from a specific different place for them. And there's also the framing, how I introduce the writer, the writer of the text. You know, I don't like labels like, for example, genocide survival at their main identity for the writer, even when it's true, you know, because it freezes them inside one action. So I prefer to name their work, their location, like artists, a writer, anything. And that's a political choice too, because I don't want the person to just only to be into what was done to them. So for me, if I follow dominant Western expectations, the text may be very easily accepted and to be less honest. If I push back at the same time, some people would say it's very political. And during the genocide, I feel that all the time. Like I was translating testimonies knowing that some readers would doubt what happened and doubt the what mentioned the text. And the easy move was always to add more drama and to explain more, or even to try to convince. But instead, I try to keep the writers calm and exact tone. And that for me is the political choice, that I refuse to prefer or to romanticize pain, and keeping the writer's voice is enough for me.
That's beautiful, Alaa. I think what you said too, like, I think it puts us in mind of so many different forms of hegemony that come into play too. Like, I think when I'm translating, I feel like I'm sort of in the crosshairs of multiple forms of hegemony. And I think the first kind of begins with in the international context, right? Like with powerful nations, and even sort of going to the roots of international law that's kind of predicated on these ideas of manifest destiny and, you know, the erasure of indigenous peoples. Like, I'm translating from North America, you know, which was sort of described as this kind of terra nullius, right? Like this empty space. So, and I think of the ways in which, you know, Palestine was kind of described as an empty space, like that, in that whole, like, what is it? The nation without a people, or the people without a nation, that whole narrative, right? And then I also think of a national hegemony where a majoritarian population sort of erases the cultural signifiers of a minority population, whether it's so in Sri Lanka, for instance, through the singularization of place names that were like traditionally Tamil places. So choosing to keep the Tamil name of a place as Kadirgamam instead of Katragama, or for instance, when I translate, you know, that's reinserting these names on the map. I think of a kind of gendered hegemony too. Like if we think in North America that about 70% of translators are women, so that it's women doing this work of translating where, then men are the creators and women are the translators, like what that means in terms of when we think of translation as work that's supposed to be invisible, where the translator is supposed to be invisible, but also heteronormative hegemony. And I think, we could go on, like even thinking of representation. What you choose to keep in the story sometimes. So when I was translating this quintet, for example, there are these little scattered narratives that kind of describe the scattering of people into diaspora. And there's a small section that happens in Thailand, where this teacher, this very upright woman sort of experiences really hard times. And, at one point, my publisher was sort of looking at it and said, well, this doesn't really do much. We can, maybe we should edit these things out. But I also discovered that the friend of this Tamil woman, this refugee, this woman who helps her, her name is Lek. And I just found that Lek is the name traditionally given to a man in Thailand. So suddenly this really complicated this character, I read this character as a trans character, and then erasing this character from the story and eliminating this segment meant, and because this character also becomes an activist. So here was sort of erasing the emergence of like queer activism from this complex story as well, and this sort of unlikely friendship that forms. So there are these choices, I think, that are kind of forced on us in terms of like editing a work to make it more palatable, as you said, for the Western reader. And I think sometimes we have to resist that in order to tell these stories kind of truthfully.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that phrase that you used right at the beginning, about being sort of in the crosshairs of multiple forms of hegemony. And I think it kind of echoes what Alaa was saying earlier, sort of in passing about some translation where, she was like, yeah, well, if you do that, then people might say that it's political, as if it were a bad thing, which I think is just sort of a through line through everything that you all have been saying.
Just to add a little bit to the very robust and complete comments that have already been made, I think that another part of this, particularly when translating into a hegemonic language like English, has to do with the selection of work that we translate and what we choose to render visible. And it reminds me actually, Alaa, you were writing about your own writing, but you have this beautiful phrase in Shrinking Language, Bursting Memory, that goes, writing becomes my resistance against the shrinking of what can be said, against the idea that our vocabulary must be limited to what fits inside headlines and humanitarian reports. And one thing that I've also found as a translator is that, this is we exist within a marketplace, and many times there is pressure from that marketplace to reproduce certain hegemonic narratives about the other, whatever that other is. In my case, writings and experiences from Latin America specifically. And I remember receiving both explicit and implicit pressure when I was working mostly on writing from Argentina to kind of find the next dictatorship novel, right? Like, or to sort of reproduce the stereotypes that are already kind of being carried by these different literary traditions. And And that's another part of sort of the resistance that I think all of us are very conscious of when we choose the work that we undertake.
A sort of follow-up question to that, which is that do you sort of often feel it almost as more of like a market pressure than any other kind of pressure? Like, is that sort of the form that it takes?
I think so. I mean, I think as you said, it's sort of a intersectional sort of hegemonic pressure. But I think one aspect of it is that it is easier to package narratives that are already familiar, even when those narratives don't actually represent the experience of a given moment or culture.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Nimi earlier mentioned this sort of like, I wrote down this phrase, precision of meaning that traces new fault lines. And I think that's exactly what translation does, and like what the political dimension of translation consists in, which is that it has to be precise. And even if you're making sort of like a broad choice, like, translating this author rather than that author, this work rather than that work, you're still translating precisely this author and precisely this work, or maybe precisely this poem, etc., right? And it's kind of inevitable that there will be meaning, including political meaning embedded in those choices, whether they're on a lexical level or sort of like on a kind of translational choice level. Yeah. Um, yeah, okay. You've all also spoken and written about, the challenges of translating war and genocide. And I'm just wondering about how you think about the weight, even if we, choose not to use necessarily sort of confine ourselves to those labels. But how do you think about the weight of what Nimi called sort of attestation in the words of the poem that was quoted? Like, how do you think about the weight of sort of testimony and the need to be both accurate and maybe fast?
Yeah, it's very heavy. It's very heavy. It's I never felt that translation is political as I felt the last 2 years. It's political because every choice I made or I make affects what people outside Gaza or outside the context are able to see, and what are still invisible. Mona Baker said something beautiful about how translation sits inside big narratives, and these narratives are the shared stories that people already believe. So when I translate, I can either slide smoothly into those dominant stories, or just can push against them a little. So accuracy is not just about did I use the right choice of the right word. It's about how I frame this story, especially from a very crazy place like Gaza. So whose voice I keep, what detail I refuse to cut out, and what I stop myself from softening just to make it more comfortable for an international reader. And for urgency, urgency is real. I've never experienced urgency is real as much as I did the last 2 years. I was translating while I was inside the same events the texts were describing. So there were two pressure at the same time. People needed their words quickly so they can publish it, they can act, they can respond. And I knew that every sentence might like later be checked, quoted, refused. So I don't have the luxury to be slow, and I also cannot be careless. And that where the ethical tension works. So the testimony needs a clarity, but the word often behave as if it needs, it needs visible pain as a proof. So I try to resist that all the time, and I refuse to add detail. And one of the hardest experience I've ever lived in my career was with Fatima Hassouna. Fatima Hassouna is a journalist and writer from Gaza. And I translated her piece, I Have No Wish to Dream Anymore. in March when she was alive, and later wrote about my experience on translating her story for Addy magazine and the essay "The Double Life of Palestinian Translator," you know. And a few months later, I had to translate my essay into Arabic for another magazine. And by then, she had been killed, and Israel killed her. So, you know, between one translation and the next, the political reality had shifted in the very worst possible way. So I was translating with a pain in my throat, and in the back of my mind, there was also this kind of thoughts that I might be the next. I could be killed anytime too. So it felt impossible to do the work in that state. I wouldn't romanticize that. And I don't know how I can say that just peacefully. But a translation is one of the few tools I have, but it's still work done under pressure. And that was real pressure for me. What I can do is to be careful and at the same time accurate, and I'm trying to respect the people whose words I carry and refuse to turn their words just to be a content, you know, when everything's just pushing just to romanticize their pain.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I was the urgency that you describe, Alaa, it sort of puts me in mind of Zung De Hoon's novel Without a Name. It's a story I often go back to because it's during the Vietnam War. It's set during the Vietnam War, and there's, you know, there are the rebels sort of cutting down trees to make coffins at the same time as, you know, the enemy is sort of is scattering Agent Orange that also defoliates the trees, but the trees are also their cover. And you know, I think of that sort of urgency, like of losing your cover at this with these multiple sort of forces of destruction that are happening. This and the cover is your safety. It's your land, right? Your culture. And I think in that context, like translation can be this testimony. It's also an archive. When I translated, while I'm translating Rashmi, for instance, in another book of his, he's he sort of documents these villages in the east coast of Sri Lanka. And with each village, he sort of talks about what they were famous for. There were handlooms that this village was famous for. There was a particular ointment that this other village was famous for. And you know, these different sort of artisanal practices, which when people are displaced, you know, there's so much that's lost. It's livelihood that's lost. It's these connections to the land that are more than just sort of a literary reference. You know, it's this lived every day of your livelihood, your labor, your medicine, everything, right? And he talks about sort of being displaced from these places, and now all there are left are torture camps in these villages. And in that poem becomes this sort of covert archive of what these villages once were, right? And that's also a kind of mapping that's going on, that's mapping in the face of erasure, you know. So I do see these works as an archive that's happening in a very urgent sense.
Yeah. I have a follow-up question, but before I ask my question, I should also invite our audience to use the Q&A function to ask any questions that you've got. I think just going to ask sort of one or two more questions before we open it up. So if you have questions for our panelists, please send them in. And I honestly don't know exactly the precise mechanics of how this is going to work, but I'm just very excited to see what your questions are and to sort of open up this conversation. Yeah, okay. So back to what you were saying about, sort of translation as archive. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about kind of the reader or readers that you envision for this translation, for this translation work, any and all of you, um, because. Yeah, because I think the concept of translation as sort of testimony or witness or archive so clearly begs the question of, like to whom, in whose memory, etc. And I think sort of is an interesting dimension of what you're talking about.
Okay, should I start?
Anyone, yeah.
I always count on you for that.
Okay. In terms of audience and my context, actually, I imagine three at once, First, the person I translate, would they just recognize themselves in the English translation? And then second, the Palestinian reader, would they feel I sold something essential to be published? And then the international reader, because, even they may feel sympathetic about Palestine, about Gaza, their imagination is still shaped by what they have been told. So I don't think I imagine a neutral reader. I imagine a very specific one, and it's shaped by English language media, basically, because I translate mainly into English. So as they say, like I try to open a small crack in that frame without just betraying the people whose words occur with me.
Yeah, I think it's important to think about your audience because I think as a translator, you get into such a close relationship with the text, right? It's a very intimate relationship with the text. You are called on to be a close reader at in a way that you don't usually do, I think. And um, and when you think of sort of while you're holding these two languages in your head, to make those choices, um, that what Benjamin calls like that word that's a flash, right? I think that those are the moments where you are thinking about your audience because who are you conveying this to? And I think for me, the audience I imagine is this sort of diasporic Tamil youth because I think about how that's the main audience, or that's the person I imagine as I'm translating because that takes some of the anxiety away about translating into English. Um, as much as I love the language. So I think about how they would receive it. What am I bringing across to them, uh, of their parents and so on. And so, for instance, in I don't translate Tamil names of trees. I don't use a Latin translation. I use the Tamil names of trees because trees are very important in our culture. Every village used to have like what's called a guardian tree. But so I want, when their parents talk about certain trees, I want them to be able to have a conversation with their parents or their grandparents about that tree and not sort of be using some Latin name that's completely alien from all of them, right? So choices like that, I think I make when I think of diasporic youth as my audience. Um, yeah.
I love that because it's sort of decentering, some supposedly objective, supposedly neutral, just sort of like um, international reader, as it were. And I think what both of you are saying is that, there is no like kind of neutral Western reader. And in fact, the audiences that we have in mind could be multiple and could be much more specific. And, um, yeah, much as one welcomes everyone to read one's translations, there could also be sort of like particular groups of people that you want to reach in a very powerful way.
I think I also I also employ non-translation within translation with in a slightly different spirit, not thinking necessarily about um, heritage Spanish speakers who actually are absolutely an audience I hope to reach as well, but also sort of hegemonic English speakers who I think, could do very well with a little bit of a pushback to the idea that everything needs to be easily digestible for them, and that the inclusion of terms that are unfamiliar. Um, Also, I'm thinking of this specific example of the milpa, right, which is a specific sort of agricultural practice in Mexico, which it's the combination of certain of beans with corn and just in a very specific traditional way that has no exact analog in Anglophone cultures. And so instead of sort of either explaining that away or using some sort of similar farming technique that would be sort of Midwestern and familiar, I choose to leave that word in Spanish, which is actually it comes from a Nahuatl word, I think. But to leave it in the original and just have that there as a moment in the text that sort of resists that sort of easy assimilation. So I think the similar gesture can function in different ways depending on sort of who's reading and when and how.
Yeah. Yeah, I like what both of you are saying about sort of plant names and farming techniques and so on, because it's almost sort of like a landscape of translation, as it were, or a landscape made by your translations. Yeah, okay. With that, super excited to move on to some audience questions. Starting maybe with yeah, with this a question of what it looks like to make translation visible. So what um, yeah, like sort of and I mean you can obviously the question is what does it look like to make translation visible? And I think you've touched on that a little bit, Heather, already with this idea of sort of non-translation nestled inside translation. But I think there are lots of other ways in which we can make sort of the translatedness of our translations visible as well. And I'm curious to hear what you all think.
So I think some of the tools that I think we've already talked about, like retaining certain names, for instance, not translating certain things. I think that's one way in which we make translation visible. right? And and I was speaking about the archive. I think of what Derrida talks about, like where the that every archive has a sort of beginning point, right? And for me, that beginning point is the land. So I I think of ways in which I can make the land visible, or and and practices associated with the land, and visible as well. So you know, so choosing not to translate certain names and things, choosing how to translate, because it's like this kind of intersemiotic process, right? Like, for instance, there's a Tamil saying, "Kudikirathu thanni, koppalikirathu pannir," which means like you drink porridge, but you gargle with rose water. And it's a way of describing, people maintaining their pride even when they don't have much. And it's such an example of dignity, holding on to your dignity. But when I translated it, someone, said, well, that eating porridge and gargling rose water, like, how does that make sense? I don't care if it makes sense to you. It's more important to me to retain the dignity of the people who, use that as a saying, right? So those are ways, like, what they call the scratches and bubbles in the glass, like that is going to um, make these things visible, make translation visible.
Yeah, I think about that a lot actually, because we translate into English, and English is not a neutral place to land in. So it's also related to my position. Like my position is double, I'm inside the story as Palestinian, live in what I translate, and then at the same time I'm using a language that sits very close to power, to institutions, to media, to. So I always ask myself this question to Nedra, like, am I serving the people I translate, or am I serving the expectations of English? So what I'm trying to do here is to treat the English language as a tool I can bend, but not an authority that I trying to please. That's it.
I'm going to throw another question into the mix, actually, from John Chocolizzi. This is a question that you already touched on, Alaa, but I'm just literally reading the question out loud. But I'd like to hear thoughts from all of you. How do you navigate the tension between the urgency of some translated subject matter and the painstakingly slow process of publication, particularly when we think about publishing with well-established literary outlets? How do we balance the desire to help gain urgent recognition for certain voices with the reality that doing so, especially through many of these outlets, can take months or years? Okay, I think everyone should have like a little bit of a go at, or anyone who wants to should have a bit of a go at this.
I don't know about like well-established literary outlets that publish translation. I mean, I guess there are some, but I've mostly been published by either small presses or, significant. One is a significant press in Canada, but um, it hasn't been a slow process for me. In fact, like I'm often just getting stuff. Um, it's hard for me to keep up with the volume of translation that is being asked of me. Um, I'm not going to make money doing this, but so
No,
that's
completely different
yeah.
thing.
So I think that's the thing, right? If you wait for that well-established, like literary publisher who's going to sell millions and make money, whatever, that's not the thing. That you publish with whoever you can publish with, a good publisher who respects the politics of your work, and then you just try and get it out there. But you have to sometimes take the show on the road in that sense, because you need to get it out to an audience. I don't know.
That's so, yeah, I don't know. That's so interesting, Nisha, that it sounds like, your experience with smaller outlets has been that they are kind of nimbler and, like you could publish with them and they're excited to have your work and you don't have to wait around for the sort of well-established place. But honestly, also, without like going greatly into detail or naming names, I've not always found that small places are necessarily super fast, right? Like I think sometimes small places can also have their own constraints, or, whether that be like budget or, like labor or so on and so forth. Sorry, you were going to say something?
No, no, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Uh, and yeah, and uh, just um, uh, I'm gonna have a go because I haven't, had a go at answering any of these questions. And I think, yeah, absolutely, this tension is a thing that I think about. And often I think it's it makes it really difficult to I think it's tricky for translators, and I'm sure publishers would have complaints about it as well. So for instance, earlier this year, earlier last year, Hong Kong was front page news for a very bad reason, which was that there's this huge fire in, some housing estate in the New Territories that killed a lot of people. One of the authors that I co-translate is one of the only authors who's sort of writing from the New Territories, as it were, which is the part of Hong Kong that's a bit closer to China, that's typically, sort of by and large less well off. Um, and um my co-translator and I working on short stories by him. And honestly, even if I think we could maybe get something into like a literary magazine faster. But even like the very fastest publication process that I can think of that includes our translation would see this book coming out, at the end of this year, at the beginning of next year, and so on, which is a very long time after anything happens in the news. And that's not coming anywhere near, some of the more um, even more urgent, even more pressing because ongoing sort of conflicts that some of the rest of you are working on. Um, yeah. I guess the other example that I have along these lines was that once I translated a memoir by a guy who was an Italian doctor working with refugees at the height of the Mediterranean refugee crisis. And I think that's, more similar in that more similar to some of these other conflicts in that it was, not an event like a fire which took several days, but an event that, just went on for a very long time. But even so, I think by the time the book arrived, the, at least the publisher felt that there was, that that the public eye had moved on to some other crisis. And then there was totally a translational question that we won't quite have time to get into in terms of sort of like framing and how the book appeared in different places and how it's presented to readers. Cool. Anyone else have something to say about this one?
Like I don't have that much experience to talk about literary outlets, but as long as the magazine itself or the literary organization that are publishing this is believe that the topic is urgent, because my experiences around translating words. So as long as they believe that this topic is urgent and they need this kind of works, they would work hard to do so. So that's it.
Um, uh, in the interest of time, I'm going to throw two more questions into the mix. Not, like that we can answer them all at once, but just that I think it's helpful to let some of these ideas percolate. So a question from Mahi about, quote, why haven't the translators of urgency used the word healer? Don't you see yourself as healers? And then a question from Nimi, which is, quote, the additional layered burden of translating when the author has died, reading them and interpreting and trying to first sort of see the frames that might have shaped this voice before dismantling, unquote. And I think in some ways, all of these questions are questions, are in different ways questions about urgency and pressingness, right? Which is maybe not so surprising in this context, but just throwing those in there as well.
Healer is a big word. I don't think we are healers, even when we translate the text we are living and the experience we are doing. We still feel helpless, and we still feel like, because it's a pity that we need to be translated to be heard as a Palestinian, for example. So I don't think we are healers. We are just mediators. We are just a tool to help you to raise our people voice. That's it.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I don't know if I can think of what we do as healing, especially when the content you translate it can be quite disturbing, right? Like it's and to also address Nimni's question, sort of translating an author who has died. I think for me, when I was translating Thammalini, I thought there would be some sort of a mental closure for me at the end of this, in this sort of post-war context. And so and I encountered a couple of like really terrible things that people were saying because she had died, and she had, as she documented her experiences in the LTTE, she had also said, like, critiqued some of their practices, and it was, I would hear things like, "Oh, she should have just taken cyanide and killed herself. Like, why did she let herself be taken prisoner?" I would hear things like, well, she betrayed her own cause by criticizing the LTT. And, I went and I read this, and this is 18 years of this woman's life that she spent in the movement. And if anyone has the right to critique it and sort of engage in this meaningful sort of reflection, that was very painful to her, that she did this while knowing that she was dying, right? Because she died of a form of stomach cancer, gastric cancer. So knowing she was dying, she took these notes, and so reading it, I was very conscious of her being in a very lonely place, and and so whatever closure I was expecting, I didn't get. But I felt, if nothing else, that this was one way in which I could make this journey with her, that in some sort of metaphysical way, that, um, yeah, that she wouldn't be alone. But it's not healing, no.
And uh, I think I agree completely. I don't think of it as a healing process, although um, the first writer I ever translated passed away 2 years ago, and I had translated 3 novels of his as a very young translator, and we had worked very collaboratively on those projects. And just thinking, I mean, if anyone is healed through translation, it might be the translator, because I think, like, I'm returning now to his work, um, and it's a very haunting experience to hear his voice, kind of the writer's voice sort of occupies your mind and your body when you're rendering a text, and to invite that back uh, in this new context. But yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to sort of join you in that moment, because it is a very the bonds that we form with the writers that we work with can go very deep, and they can leave quite a mark.
Thank you so much, both of you, all of you. Okay, we're at time. I want to respect people's time, but there are also two more great questions on the line. So how would you all feel if I sort of call it, and then just ask the panelists to like stay for another 5 minutes and we can get to Jonathan and James's questions, if that's okay with you. Another 5 minutes? Okay. Well, everyone, we are going to do another couple of questions. But I also know that we're sort of at, we plan to go for about an hour. Thank you so much for coming. Feel free to stick around for what I hope will be sort of like a casual 5 or 10 minutes of just sort of getting to some of these other questions and talking through some of the things that have come up. So it's tricky with this sort of thing because, like right when it ends, you also feel like, but now we're getting to the good stuff. Just for whoever has time to stay on. Okay. I'm going to read Jonathan and James's questions. So Jonathan, Nedra touched on this with the idea of deciding which names for trees to use as opposed to their Latin ones. But have any of you encountered a moment when something felt untranslatable and, needed to make sure that you were choosing the right words? How did that reshape your understanding of the text? And James said some lovely things about the talk, and then said, in these terrifying times, given that, all of us are translating into English, what do we think about the English language itself and its limitations and or capacity to give expression to the ideas that we might want to express? Either or both.
I think Heather should go first this time.
I was actually just going to ask you to repeat the second question because I was
Yes, absolutely. Oh, okay. So the question is, I'm just going to read it, read the words themselves again. Quote, in these terrifying times when the horses of destruction are rampaging across so much of the world, is there more important work than that of translation? Which I think is arguably a question. And then the next, and then he says, I think all of you are translating into English. What do you think about the English language itself, its limitations and or capacity to give ideas to the idea, to give expression to the ideas you want to express? Which, English, speaking of a tool, yes, it certainly has limitations.
I think that working from any language into any other language, you're going to find that you gain certain things, you gain certain sort of tools and capacities in the translating language, and you inevitably lose certain things. I think English is very good at doing I think English is excellent with sort of concision and sort of compound words and things like that that I enjoy working with from Spanish into English. Every pair is going to be different, but and I do think translation is a very important work, but it is certainly not the only important work. Yes, there are other things, and I think they can go hand in hand. Any person who has a capacity in more than one language can be doing work both inside their computer screen and outside in their community, particularly in these times. So that's sort of my partial answer to both questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's like we never actually got to this bit, right? But I think certainly you, Heather, and no, actually all of you, I think, have done some form of work that involves translation and also sort of is deeply enmeshed with your communities. And yeah, in some ways they're sort of hard to separate from from each other almost when you're thinking about translation as testimony or as making voices heard.
Yeah, for me too, as I wrote before, English is when I try to translate to English, I feel like English is my exile because, you know, English trying to be also try to be like the language of neutral objectivity. But so somehow I feel like all the time when I translate something political or witness or short story from Gaza, I feel like I need to resist the structure of the English language. There is the structure of diplomacy from, you know, that kind of distance and the stuff. And that is the opposite in the Arabic. Arabic is very heavy language and it's very descriptive and it's very rich. So I feel like I'm really resisting this kind of structure, resisting like the English structure. Sorry, it's late here. I already feel sleepy now. So yeah, that's my answer.
I think we're in similar places, you know. And Heather, I was thinking of your essay on your introduction to which is what cannot be translated into English. And you know, I say this as someone who doesn't think of English as kind of a blunt instrument. I do enjoy playing with the language. I find that the things that are often untranslatable are the sensibility. You know, Tamil people are just so extra. Like we are, like you watch these teledramas and whatever, and you'll get a sense, like, you know. So if I literally tried to translate some of that into English, it would sound very melodramatic. So it's like a travesty, you know, like really dressing up a tragedy as a comedy sort of thing. Like it just wouldn't work sometimes. So there's that that I sort of think about, and there's something else I was thinking about that was that's untranslatable, but it's not uh, coming to me right now.
Which is
But
actually of a piece of of a piece with what Alaa was saying about, you know, like the heaviness of Arabic, right? Or the extraness of Tamil. Like I think all of those things are related, you know.
yeah, yeah, and in terms of oh yeah, the limitations of the language. Um, so when the reason I go back to the landscape, for instance, is like ancient Tamil poetry connects human beings to the landscape in very profound, meaningful, and very complex ways, right? So that your emotions are reflected in the landscape, or you know, there's emotions associated with particular landscapes, and the poems sort of, you know, refer to these the flora and fauna of that landscape and that set of emotions. But when but in English, if you wanted to talk about the natural world reflecting your emotions or vice versa, that's called a pathetic fallacy, right? So there is something in English that already sort of wants to distance you from the natural world. Um, so that is the part that I often sort of struggle with, this kind of how do you explain these connections to the land, you know, that are burdened with so much like emotional import, when already in English there's this distance that's created, right? So those are the kinds of things that I find really hard to translate. Yeah.
Yeah, that's super interesting. What do you do with a language where the thing that you're trying to do is named a fallacy? I mean, great, thanks very much. Cool. Okay, on that note of great incompleteness, let's call it a panel. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you again to Adi Magazine.
Thank you
And
so
thank you
much.
to all of you for being part of this conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for hosting us. And it's been so lovely being in conversation with all of you.
Yes,
Truly.
thank you all so very much. I just want to throw in as a final parting note that Heather and Nedra and Alaa have all published with Adi, so I encourage you to check out their work on Adi Magazine and elsewhere. And otherwise, we wish you all a wonderful night.
Amazing.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.